Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into one of Canada's most infamous cases, the story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka.
Oh, yeah, this one. A case that really, raises questions about criminal behavior, the justice system, and the long-lasting impact on victims and society as a whole.
You've shared some material on this case, and, well, we're ready to break it down. Help us understand why this story is so unsettling, even after all this time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the material we had paints a picture of Paul and Karla before they met. Seemingly normal lives. Paul was a business student.
Hmm.
Karla loved animals and worked at a vet clinic. Is this typical, for individuals who commit these kinds of acts?
It might surprise you, but there's often this disconnect between the criminal's outward appearance and their inner world.
Okay.
Paul, for instance, he came from a difficult family, and there were signs, even back in his teen years, of troubling behavior.
Yeah.
What's really interesting here is that while living this seemingly ordinary life, Paul was already the Scarborough rapist,
Right.
terrorizing women with sexual assaults, living a double life, which speaks to that complex psychology of compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of your personality and behavior.
Oh, wow. That's chilling to think that someone could be capable of such horrific acts while maintaining that facade of normalcy. So how does that develop? Is it inherent or is it learned?
That's the million-dollar question psychologists are always trying to figure out. There's no easy answer, no single answer.
Right.
But understanding it is so crucial for criminal profiling and prevention. In Paul's case, his family issues definitely could have played a role. But it's important to remember, a difficult childhood doesn't automatically equal a life of crime.
Right.
It's a really complex interplay of nature and nurture, and researchers are still working on it.
Still trying to untangle all that. So Paul is already on a dark path.
Yeah,
Then he meets Karla. They're good-looking, seemingly have this picture-perfect romance.
the Ken and Barbie Killers.
Yeah, Ken and Barbie Killers, which on the one hand captures the public's fascination,
Right,
but also, as the material points out, kind of trivializes what they did.
absolutely. The nickname might make the case memorable, but we can't forget the real people who suffered these unimaginable horrors. Behind the facade, their relationship was anything but perfect.
Right.
Our material details how Karla, probably drawn in at first by Paul's charisma, gradually became submissive to his controlling and abusive behavior.
This dynamic seems crucial to understanding how things escalated, and the material shows this turning point. Karla's younger sister, Tammy, enters the picture. Paul becomes fixated on her. And Karla, disturbingly, helps him.
Yeah, this is where it takes a really dark turn. The events surrounding Tammy's death, originally thought to be an accident,
Yeah.
were actually full of suspicious circumstances. Chemical burns, inconsistencies in their stories. This should have raised red flags. It points to possible failures in the initial investigation, which later on fueled that public anger once the truth came out.
It's hard to even comprehend, to think that a family could be so deceived. And a young girl, a seemingly innocent teenager, becomes the victim of such a twisted plot.
It's a stark reminder of how manipulative abusers can be and the devastating consequences of their actions. Tammy's death emboldened Paul and Karla, and just 6 months later, as they were preparing for their wedding, they abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey.
Wow, so this wasn't just a continuation, this was a clear escalation.
Right.
They brought her to their home, tortured her for 24 hours, and then killed her to keep her quiet. And then the way they disposed of her body was just horrific.
The methodical nature of it all, the videotaping the torture, suggests premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion.
Right.
This was a calculated, cruel act.
So they get married, this fairy tale romance, masking a horrifying secret. And then, less than a year later, Kristen French is abducted.
Another teenage girl, lured into their car, taken back to their house. The pattern was clear, and the brutality escalated. But Kristen, she tried to fight back, leave clues. It shows her incredible bravery in a terrifying situation.
Wow.
While a frantic manhunt was underway, the whole community just gripped with fear.
The source material mentions the delayed DNA testing. Paul had already given a sample back in 1990 during the Scarborough rapist investigation.
Right.
But because of a backlog, it wasn't processed until 1993.
Chilling example of how systemic issues can have such devastating consequences. Had that DNA evidence been processed sooner, who knows how many lives could have been spared.
Makes you wonder how many other cases, how many other perpetrators were out there free to continue because of those delays.
Yeah. And while all this is happening, cracks are starting to show in Paul and Karla's relationship.
Okay.
Paul becomes increasingly abusive. blames Karla for his own failings.
Mm.
And eventually she goes to the police. This leads to the infamous deal with the devil.
So Karla agreed to testify against Paul in exchange for a lighter sentence. Prosecutors must have been under immense pressure to get a conviction, especially with the horrific nature of the crimes.
Absolutely. At the time, they believed Karla's testimony was the key to making sure Paul didn't escape justice. But then, everything changed. The videotapes were discovered.
Ah, this is where things get legally and ethically complex.
Exactly. It wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. It was about the moral dilemmas of justice and plea bargains and the potential consequences. The discovery of those tapes really changed everything. They showed just how involved Karla really was. A much more disturbing picture than her initial testimony suggested.
Right.
The plea deal, which had been seen as, a necessary evil at the time,
Right.
now looked like a betrayal of justice.
Wow. It's amazing how new evidence can totally change public perception and even legal strategies. I imagine those tapes were incredibly disturbing, even for seasoned investigators.
Oh, they were horrifying. They documented everything. The torture, the abuse, in graphic detail.
Oh, wow.
Deciding how much of that footage to show in court.
Right.
It was a huge ethical problem. It was crucial evidence, but there was also the risk of re-traumatizing the families and maybe sensationalizing the case.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, transparency versus protecting people from that kind of content. So how did the trial go forward with all this?
It was a media circus. Everywhere you looked, there it was.
Yeah.
And despite all the publication bans, the case just captivated the country. The tapes, even with the redactions, they were damning. They backed up Karla's testimony. And ultimately, Paul was convicted of first-degree murder, multiple sexual assaults, and sentenced to life in prison.
Life in prison, but was there any chance of parole for someone who had committed such horrific crimes?
Not really, no. Given what he did, it was highly unlikely. He was later declared a dangerous offender, which is reserved for people who are considered a high risk to public safety. So basically, Paul will probably never be released.
And what about Karla? Her 12-year sentence as part of the deal seemed really light to a lot of people, especially after they found out everything.
Oh, yeah. The public was furious.
Yeah.
The deal with the devil, as it was called, became a symbol of injustice. People felt like Karla had gotten away with murder, that the system had failed them.
I can understand that. Given what happened, it makes sense that people would be upset. So what happened when Karla was released? How did she try to rebuild her life with all that anger and scrutiny?
She was released in 2005 after serving her 12 years. And instantly, she faced this intense public scrutiny.
Right.
They tried to restrict movements. There were protests wherever she went. The media just wouldn't leave her alone. She tried to disappear, changed her name, started over, but her past followed her everywhere.
It raises a difficult question. What does paying your debt to society actually mean? When you've done something so terrible, can you ever really escape the stigma? Can you ever rebuild a life free from judgment and fear?
That's a really tough one that society is still wrestling with. Reintegration for convicted criminals, especially those who commit high-profile crimes. It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
It's hard for the public to think about forgiveness and second chances in those cases.
And Paul, where is he now? How's he dealt with being behind bars?
He's still in prison. He's had multiple parole hearings, but they've all been denied. He'll most likely die there. And, the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French have been incredibly strong.
Right.
They've attended those hearings, made sure their daughters' voices are heard, and reminded everyone of the pain and loss that Paul caused.
It's amazing that they can be so strong after such a tragedy. We've covered the crimes, the trial, the aftermath, but we also wanted to understand the bigger impact. How did this case change Canada? What were the ripple effects outside the courtroom?
This case wasn't just about two people. It forced Canada to face some really hard truths about the justice system, about society, about what evil really is. And on a practical level, it led to improvements in forensic science.
Like the backlog in DNA testing, that was a big push for change, right?
Huge. The case showed those systemic problems that let a dangerous predator stay free for so long.
Right.
So more funding was given to forensic labs, procedures were streamlined, and there was a new focus on how important timely DNA analysis is.
So some good came out of this terrible situation. Were there other areas where the case led to reforms or new ways of thinking?
Definitely. The controversy surrounding Karla's plea deal, it got everyone talking about plea bargains. It forced people to reevaluate how those agreements are made, how transparent they are, and how the public might react when they seem too lenient.
Makes you wonder, did it change the way plea bargains are handled in Canada?
It definitely had an impact. There's a greater awareness now of how complicated they are, the need to get convictions, but also make sure justice is truly served. And the case also brought domestic violence into the spotlight.
Right.
Karla's claims of being abused, though they were challenged, were a big part of her defense.
And this was happening at a time when society's view of domestic violence was changing, right?
Exactly. The case, even with all the disturbing details, forced people to see the realities of coercive control, how abusers trapped their victims. It wasn't just a case of she was forced, but it started a wider discussion about domestic abuse, the challenges victims face, and the need for more awareness and support.
This case also seemed to start a debate about the media, ethics, the public's right to know, especially with the publication bans during the trial.
It was a turning point in how Canadian media covers these kinds of crimes. The bans were meant to protect the trial, the family's privacy, but they also raised questions about transparency, the public's right to information. It started a discussion about informing the public, but also being responsible, avoiding sensationalism, protecting people from more harm.
So even though it happened decades ago, this case is still shaping how Canada thinks about crime, justice, media, even the nature of evil.
It definitely is. The Bernardo Homolka case wasn't just a crime, it was a cultural earthquake. And we're still feeling the aftershocks.
It's amazing how one case can have such a ripple effect. We've covered so much: the chilling details of the crimes, the legal and ethical questions, the impact on Canadian society.
We've seen how seemingly ordinary people can be capable of such darkness, and how pursuing justice can be full of hard choices.
This has been quite a heavy conversation. I imagine this is one of those cases that stays with you, even after you've learned about it. Makes you question a lot about human nature.
Oh, absolutely. It really challenges those ideas we have about good and evil, about how well we can really know someone, and about the limits of justice and rehabilitation.
You mentioned earlier the power of true crime stories. Why do you think these stories are so captivating and so disturbing at the same time?
I think deep down we have this natural curiosity about the dark side of humanity. True crime allows us to look into those dark corners, but from a safe distance.
Right.
It also gives us a glimpse into the minds of the people who do these unthinkable things. Maybe we're trying to understand how this could happen, trying to find some reason for the seemingly unreasonable.
Yeah, like trying to make sense of the tickos, find logic where there doesn't seem to be any.
Exactly. And in doing so, we face our own vulnerabilities, our own fears. These stories remind us that evil isn't always some shadowy figure. It can be in everyday people we think we know.
In this case, the Bernardo Homolka case, with all its twists and turns, it really makes it hard to find simple explanations.
Absolutely. It forces us to see that human behavior is complex, that morality isn't always black and white. There aren't always clear-cut heroes and villains.
We've talked about the practical changes that came from this case, the forensic science improvements, the debates about plea bargains, media ethics, but are there bigger lessons here? What can we learn from this tragedy to prevent something like this from happening again?
I think one of the biggest lessons is to be vigilant, to see those warning signs, even the small ones, and not ignore them, to recognize that abusive behavior often gets worse over time, and to step in before it goes too far.
So paying attention to those red flags, trusting our gut when something feels off.
Yeah. And creating a culture where people feel safe to speak out, to report abuse, to get help, without being judged or punished.
Right.
We also have to remember that victims of abuse, especially when it's coercive control, often have a very hard time leaving their abusers.
This case shows how important it is to understand domestic violence, and that it's not always easy to just walk away.
Exactly. We need a support system that understands how complicated these situations are, and that gives victims the resources and protection they need to get out.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, and this case has definitely given us a lot to think about, both the specifics and what it means for society.
It has. It's a case that will probably continue to be studied and debated for a long time, a case that makes us ask difficult but important questions about ourselves, about the world.
Knowing what we know now, how do we find that balance? The need for justice, but also the possibility of rehabilitation. How do we learn from this and stop something like this from happening again? These questions go way beyond this one case.
You're absolutely right. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from our deep dive today. This isn't just theoretical. These are questions that need our attention, our careful thought, and our continued effort to create a safer, more just world.
Thank you for joining us on this tough but important deep dive. It's been a heavy conversation, but I hope it's given you a better understanding of this case and how far its impact reaches. And with any luck, it's given you some things to think about as we all try to make sense of human behavior and the search for justice. Until next time.